An auger pulled sediment from a canyon in western Idaho, and inside the core was a stone point, half an inch long, edges still sharp. It was 16,000 years old, and it matched nothing else in the Americas. Summer 2009. Lauren Davis and his field school from Oregon State University were working a river terrace above the Salmon River in western Idaho at a site called Cooper's Ferry. Students with trowels, sediment in buckets, the canyon walls baking in the afternoon heat. Standard archaeology, expected results. Then someone pushed an auger into the ground, a cylinder coring tool they use to preview what's buried before committing to a full excavation. The core came up, and inside it, caught in the sediment, was a stemmed projectile point. Not a fluted Clovis tip, but something different, something older. Davis stopped the auger work immediately and opened a conventional trowel excavated unit. The next day they found another point, and the day after that, a third. Davis said it plainly in the field. Finding two stem projectile points in proximity to each other is just something that we dream about, but it did happen here. The samples went to Oxford University for radiocarbon dating, and what they sent was charcoal from a deliberately built hearth, engineered with fire-cracked rocks designed to retain heat, found in the same layer as the points. The results came back, 16,500 to 16,300 years before present. Davis described what that felt like. When I first saw that the lower archaeological layer contained radiocarbon ages older than 14,000 years, I was stunned but skeptical and needed to see those numbers repeated over and over, just to be sure they're right. So we ran more radiocarbon dates, and the lower layer consistently dated between 14,000 and 16,000 years old. 16,000 years. That number matters because of a specific geographical problem, because 16,000 years ago, the corridor through Canada did not exist. The Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets were at maximum extent, a barrier more than a mile thick from Alaska to Montana. And even if a crack had temporarily opened, recent paleo-environmental data shows it would have been a barren wasteland with no plants, no animals, and nothing to eat. You cannot walk south through Canada if Canada is buried under a mile of ice, and everything inside it is dead. So who were these people and how did they get here? Before anyone could answer that question, the field had to bury the model that made the question impossible to ask. For most of the 20th century, the textbook answer was called the Clovis first model. Big game hunters crossed a land bridge from Siberia around 13,500 years ago and travelled south through a narrow corridor between two retreating Canadian ice sheets, leaving behind distinctive stone tools, fluted projectile points first identified near Clovis, New Mexico. The tools showed up across North America, and the model became settled science, taught in universities, repeated in textbooks. Then a scholar named Tom Dillahay at Vanderbilt University excavated a site called Monte Verde on the southern coast of Chile and found evidence pushing human occupation there back to roughly 14,500 years ago. That's 1,000 years before Clovis people appear anywhere in North America, and thousands of miles south of where they would have entered if they had come through the Canadian corridor. That didn't fit, and the field told him so for over a decade. Because every pre-Clovis site gets the same treatment, contamination. The samples must be mixed, the association between the artifacts and the dates is compromised, and this is how a dominant model protects itself, not through dishonesty, but through a structurally higher burden of proof for anything that threatens it. One site you can always dismiss as contamination. In 2016, a nature study led by paleogeneticist Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen found that the ice-free corridor only became biologically habitable 12,600 years ago. But people were already living in Chile at 14,500 years ago. The corridor didn't work. The numbers were broken, and anyone who looked carefully enough at them knew it. John Erlandson, archaeologist and director of the University of Oregon Museum of Natural and Cultural History, summed it up. With Monte Verde, the Clovis first model began to sink. Now it's dead in the water. Monte Verde challenged the model, but Cooper's Ferry demolished it. And what they found in that Idaho canyon was stranger than anyone expected, because the tools weren't just old, they were familiar from somewhere 5,000 miles away. The Nez Perce knew the site at the confluence of Rock Creek and the lower Salmon River as Nipehe, an ancient village that their oral traditions had long identified as inhabited. Davis's teams excavated there from 2009 to 2018 with more than 200 students rotating through over a decade of field seasons. Summer temperatures in the canyon can hit 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the team had to bring water in from outside and stay alert for rattlesnakes and black widow spiders. This wasn't comfortable work. The upper layers returned exactly what you'd expect, Clovis points, the familiar fluted spear tips that the textbook model was built on. The model wasn't wrong about Clovis being in North America. It was wrong about Clovis being first. Below those layers, the sediment changed. The Clovis points disappeared, and what replaced them in the layer the team designated LU3 was something different: 189 lithic artifacts with 27 complete tools. 13 of them were stemmed projectile points ranging from 1/2 inch to 2 inches long, with edges that fracture like glass, made from cryptocrystalline silicite, a high-quality stone that wasn't available at the site itself. It had been transported from geological deposits 16 kilometers away. People don't carry specific stones 16 kilometers by accident. They planned it. And the way the tools were stored told you something else entirely. Many were found in deliberately excavated holes, cache pits in archaeological terms, and one pit, Feature P1, had been dug into the ground, filled with tools and capped. Davis described what it revealed. Excavating Feature P1 at Cooper's Ferry has allowed us to see some of the behaviour that early peoples were exhibiting at this site in relation to storage of items. Allows us to think about things like forward thinking, logistical planning, and other kinds of aspects of making a living in this canyon. People don't cache tools in random locations. They cache in places they know, places they trust, places they plan to return to. Which means this wasn't a transient camp. These were people with a home territory. By the third day of excavating Feature P1 in 2012, the team had recovered 13 stemmed projectile points from a single pit. Davis later said, "As the excavators worked very carefully to take the contents of the pit fill apart, they kept finding projectile points over and over and over again. And this was actually quite surprising. It's not unusual to find projectile points, but it's so unusual to find so many in one place." Then there were the bones. Among the 86 faunal fragments found in direct association with the tools were tooth fragments from an extinct Ice Age horse, Equus, a species that would die out at the end of the Pleistocene. Humans alongside megafauna in Idaho 16,000 years ago. Say that number slowly and then ask the question that drove the next decade of research. The tools at Cooper's Ferry were stemmed, not fluted, representing a specific and deliberate manufacturing tradition. Where had that tradition come from? 5,000 miles west of Cooper's Ferry on the northern island of Hokkaido, archaeologists had found stone tools made through the same reduction method, with the same stemmed base, from a different hand and a different century, but somehow the same idea. The stemmed points from Cooper's Ferry weren't random shapes. They were produced through a specific manufacturing sequence with identical core reduction methods, predetermined flake blanks using what are called levallois-like techniques, meaning the napper planned the exact shape of the flake before making the first strike, and stemmed bases designed for a particular kind of hafting onto wooden shafts. Not fluted like Clovis, but a completely different tradition. The same manufacturing sequence appears in late Upper Paleolithic tools from Hokkaido, Japan, dated to approximately 20,000 years ago. And this isn't a superficial resemblance. It's the same steps, in the same order. Davis said, "We hypothesize that this may signal a cultural connection between early peoples who lived around the northern Pacific Rim, and that traditional technological ideas spread from northeastern Asia into North America at the end of the last glacial period. Researchers are now measuring the geometry of these points precisely through morphometric shape analysis, comparing tool forms across sites and time periods the way you'd compare fingerprints. The team described it: we measure the shape of it, we can understand how it's created, and we can compare it to other places in the landscape and also at other time periods. And in doing so, we can say how similar are they to other sites, to other regions, and begin to reconstruct this network of who is sharing knowledge with whom over time and space. Tools carry knowledge, they're evidence of who was teaching whom. The genetics pointed in the same direction. A 2009 mitochondrial DNA study of 16 Jomon skeletons from the Funadomari site in Hokkaido found that these ancient Japanese people shared haplogroup D1, a specific genetic marker with Native Americans. That's not living Japanese populations, but ancient skeletal DNA from Hokkaido, shared with people who ended up in the Americas. And people on Honshu were already demonstrating the maritime capability the journey required, making open water crossings more than 20,000 years ago to Kozushima Island, 50 kilometers away, specifically to collect volcanic glass for toolmaking. The seafaring capacity existed long before the migration is hypothesized to have begun. In 1999 and 2000, an American named John Turk kayaked from Japan to Alaska, physically retracing the presumed coastal migration route, and he completed the journey. A real person did it, which means it can be done. The ecological corridor that would have sustained the journey has a name: the Kelp Highway. This runs from Japan to Baja California as a near-continuous belt of kelp forest ecosystems along the Pacific Rim, supporting fish, seals, sea otters, shellfish and seabirds, and Erlandson described it as teeming with food resources and offering holdfasts and protection from wave energy, which would have made for a relatively rapid and unobstructed journey to North America. But if the tools match Japan, does that mean the people specifically came from Japan? A scientist in Nevada analysed 1,500 sets of teeth, and the teeth said something different. 3 separate sites are saying the same thing. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho is 16,000 years old, predating any possible opening of the inland corridor. Monteverde in Chile dates to 14,500 years ago, a full 1,000 years before Clovis people appear anywhere in North America. And Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon is where University of Oregon archaeologist Dennis Jenkins uncovered human coprolites, desiccated human feces, in 2002, dated to 14,000 years ago, which means the oldest human remains in the Western Hemisphere aren't bones. They're freeze-dried excrement in a cave in Oregon. 3 separate sites independent of each other reached the same conclusion. Willeslev's 2016 Nature study made the arithmetic explicit. The ice-free corridor only became biologically habitable 12,600 years ago, but people were already in Chile at 14,500 years ago. The numbers don't work. Todd Brage of San Diego State University, reviewing the Cooper's Ferry paper in Science, stated it without qualification: the Clovis first model is no longer viable. Erlandson framed the reorientation in a single sentence: now that the ice-free corridor has been shown to be dead in the water, no pun intended, we can start to look at something like a coastal migration route. The contamination objection protected the model for decades, and it worked not because of bad faith, but because institutional inertia is real. A dominant model accumulates credibility over time, and every threat to it faces a higher evidentiary bar than the model itself ever did. Dillahay defended Monteverde for a decade before the field accepted it, and Davis ran the radiocarbon dates over and over until the numbers were unimpeachable. So the coastal route is real, but the question is who exactly was on the water. And that brings us to G. Richard Scott and 1,500 sets of teeth. G. Richard Scott is the Foundation Professor of Anthropology at the University of Nevada, Reno, and he published a study in the journal Paleo-America titled Peopling the Americas Not Out of Japan. His method was called Rasudus 2, Ancestry Assessment through Tooth Crown and Root Morphology, which is a way of reading biological relationships from the shape of teeth. He and his team analysed over 1,500 dentitions from the Americas, Asia and the Pacific. The logic is straightforward. You can hand someone a tool and teach them to copy it without sharing a single ancestor, but genes travel inside bodies and teeth preserve those genes in ways that survive for millennia. Tools and biology are different kinds of evidence. What Scott found was that only 7% of Jomon and Ainu dental samples could be linked to non-Arctic Native Americans. 7%. And the Jomon themselves turned out to have significant Austral Melanesian ancestry, meaning they were already a genetically complex population with Southern Asian connections, not a simple Northeast Asian group that tidally migrated east. Scott was direct. I knew long ago that Jomon teeth were nothing like those of Native Americans. I've analysed a lot of dental data from native circumpolar and North American populations, and there is no similarity. And these people did not come from Japan, but further north, where they were sculpted by the last glacial maximum. So if the tools match Hokkaido and the teeth don't match the Jomon, what's the answer? It's a real tension. And it deserves a real answer because tools and biology are measuring different things. A manufacturing tradition can spread through contact, through teaching, through trade across populations that share no common ancestor. But haplogroups travel inside bodies. The teeth and the tools aren't contradicting each other. They're describing different phenomena. Scott made this distinction explicit in his paper. The maritime Pacific coastal migration route isn't disputed by his findings, and only the specific claim that the Jomon were the ancestral source population is rejected. His own words, "We're using biological evidence to say that it's highly unlikely that they came out of Japan. The source population came from further north, shaped by the last glacial maximum, consistent with Beringian origins. What survives is the boat, the kelp highway, the coastal route. What doesn't survive is the specific claim that shared tool traditions prove Japanese ancestry, because the people who carried that manufacturing knowledge into the Americas came from somewhere north of Japan. The route almost certainly existed, but the proof is mostly underwater." Climate modelling published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences identified two windows with the most favourable conditions for coastal migration from 24,500 to 22,000 years ago, and from 16,400 to 14,800 years ago. The Cooper's Ferry dates, roughly 16,000 to 15,000 years before present, fall inside the second window almost exactly. Erlandson described how the picture had shifted since the original Kelp Highway proposal. When the Kelp Highway was proposed, we thought the first Americans arrived between 16,000 and 14,000 years ago, when Beringia was relatively warm. It is now more likely that humans moved into North America between 20,000 and 16,000 years ago, with colder climates and extensive winter sea ice. Winter sea ice, which sounds like an obstacle, turns out to be more complicated than that. When conditions were right, it could bridge island gaps along the coast and actually facilitated travel between the islands of the North Pacific. So these were not summer sailors, they were adapted to both. Erlandson put it this way: the first Americans had to be co-adapted to both winter sea ice and summer kelp forest habitats. It is a much more interesting story now. Then Davis provided the geographic logic that explains why Idaho specifically, rather than some coastal site, holds the oldest confirmed inland evidence. The Salmon River is a tributary of the Columbia River Basin, and the Columbia is the first major river south of the glaciers where coastal travelers could have turned inland. Davis said, "Early peoples moving south along the Pacific coast would have encountered the Columbia River as the first place below the glaciers where they could easily walk and paddle into North America." Essentially, the Columbia River corridor was the first off-ramp of a Pacific coast migration route. And the Salmon River Canyon has something else: salmon. Massive annual runs would have made this specific canyon a resource magnet for people whose entire subsistence tradition was built around aquatic food. So the geography and the ecology converge here, but the route was not purely coastal. Erlandson said, "The Kelp Highway hypothesis does not assert a headlong rush along the ancient coastline. Rather, seafaring people were likely exploring and settling along major rivers as well, which acted as corridors into the interior." Davis framed the human motivation in terms that make these people feel recognizable rather than ancient and alien. Just like people today are trying to reach the top of Mount Everest or the South Pole, I'm sure these hunter-gatherers were also explorers and curious about what would be on the other side of these glacier caps. Dennis Jenkins at Paisley Caves in south-central Oregon in 2002 found the oldest direct human evidence in the hemisphere: 14,000-year-old coprolites sitting in a cave exactly along the path that coastal migrants following rivers into the interior would have passed through. Erlandson said, "Paisley filled an important gap in the coastal migration theory and made Oregon central to the study of the first Americans. The structural problem, though, may never be fully resolved. The most diagnostic evidence for a coastal migration, the campsites, the middens, the tools left at the shoreline, would have sat on the coast as it existed 16,000 years ago. That coast is now underwater because sea levels have risen since the end of the last glacial maximum, and the earlier the coastal occupation occurred, the further underwater the evidence now sits." Erlandson described the challenge plainly. The main challenge we face in testing the Kelp Highway hypothesis is that much of the evidence of pre-Clovis coastal occupations would now be submerged by rising seas, and the earlier such occupations may have occurred, the further off modern shores the evidence would now exist. The response has been a $900,000 offshore mapping project run with tribal partners, geologists, biologists, and archaeologists from multiple universities. They're reconstructing submerged paleo landscapes using on-land archaeological sites as predictive templates, looking for underwater caves, springs, toolstone outcrops, and natural overlooks, the same geographic features that drew people to coastal sites on dry land, now sitting on the continental shelf in the dark. Erlandson summed up the task. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. We're trying to make the needle bigger and the haystack smaller. Loren Davis, holding a stemmed projectile point made 16,000 years ago, said, "To hold something in your hand that's that old, to think about someone actually taking a block of rock and, through this whole sequence of steps, turning it into this spear point that I have in my hand. It's really pretty amazing. Someone napped that point from cryptocrystalline silicite carried 16 kilometers to a canyon above the Salmon River, then buried it with a dozen others in a pit they plan to return to, hunting Ice Age horses in a landscape that has been under 16,000 years of subsequent human history since they put it in the ground. The proof of how they arrived is sitting on the continental shelf in the dark under 60 meters of ocean, where it has been since the ice retreated. The needle is waiting, the haystack is very large. The tool outlived the hand.